Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first webinar of Transforming Construction webinar series. Sorry, I'm going to make sure everyone can see that right. My name is Brandon Searle, and I'll be our moderator for today. So just a quick overview of the webinar. Obviously, welcome. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'll do a quick intro to the Offsite Construction Research Center, as well as Building Transformations, which is a not-for-profit organization who we've partnered with to deliver the webinars. I'll introduce the Cast Consultancy team. There'll be a presentation from Jeff, Michelle, and Lee, followed by a moderated Q&A and discussion and wrap-up. Now, this is our first time doing this over Microsoft Teams instead of Zoom, so we may have some issues, hopefully not, but if you have any issues, feel free to just reach out via the Q&A feature in the control bar. That's where you'll submit questions, but also if you have issues with audio or visual, just send through that. Again, if you have difficulty hearing, check your audio settings, make sure it's set up to the right speakers. Any other problems, just shoot a message in the Q&A feature. And just a reminder for the group, all sessions are going to be recorded, or are being recorded, sorry. They'll then be put on the Offsite Construction Research Center website, as well as Building Transformations YouTube page. And the presentation from today will also be shared with attendees. So just a little bit about the University of New Brunswick. We're located in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and was founded in 1785. UNB is home to Canada's first engineering, forestry, and computer science programs, with engineering courses first being offered in 1854. For the folks from the UK, you might think that's still pretty young, but a lot of the academic institutions aren't as old as overseas. Since then, UNB has grown significantly with campuses in both Fredericton and St. John, over 25 leading research institutes and centers, and over 20 world-class research chairs. In addition to the research success, UNB has been very successful in helping foster a startup community on the east coast of Canada, and has seen over 100 startups in the last decade, and were named Canada's most entrepreneurial university by Startup Canada when it was last named a decade ago. So the Offsite Construction Research Center started at UNB through the announcement in September 2018 in partnership with an organization called OSCO Construction Group. Since then, the center has evolved, and we really refreshed a strategic plan in 2022 with a focus on the values of being industry relevant, collaboration, excellence, and integrity. Obviously, being a research center that was founded in partnership with industry, relevance to industry through applied research is key to everything we do. And then within that, we have three pillars. So knowledge creation, obviously through the research we do, knowledge mobilization, which includes mobilizing that through conferences and disseminating the research to our industry colleagues, and then governance and operations. So if you've worked in academia or been associated with a research center in academia, they often come and go with funding from industry or government. We hope to be around for a very long time, and we're in year 6 now, and hoping trying to ensure that there's sustainability within the center. So governance and operations was key to our strategic plan. A little bit about governance within the center. So unlike most centers at academic institutions, we have a majority advisory board or executive board from the private sector. You see the names along the right there. But representing the research office is Kelly Ashfield, and representing engineering is Jeff Rankin. And then below that, there's about a dozen industry reps. All have been, probably combined 300 to 400 years of experience in the construction sector, and they're representing everything from steel fabricator, precast concrete, mass timber, general contractor, or tier 1 contractor, volumetric manufacturer, panelized systems, a developer, architects, M&E contractor, and even with Ben Coles from RJ Bartlett as a specialized consultant, specifically fire consultant. So we have representation, and they kind of advise and ensure that the work we're doing and our strategy aligns with the needs of the construction industry. Research services that we offer focus at the micro level, let's say, on process and productivity improvement, digital technology implementation, and lab testing services. And then just in terms of our four themes within the research center, I just listed kind of the first three, but process and productivity improvement, that's around helping manufacturers increase their productivity, safety, and quality through simulation, factory layout, DFMA theory, and so on. Use that through the implementation of digital tech, so BIM, VDC, AR, VR, MR technologies. We're growing in our building enclosure space and have recently opened a new lab in that space, but to do testing for structural and building enclosures on panelized and volumetric modular connections, MEP connections, material testing, and so on. And then finally, which is more aligned with where I sit in the benchmarking and innovation in construction, we're doing a lot of national or regional roadmaps for housing and strategies for housing and work around assessing the maturity of the sector to then grow. So that's a little bit about the OCRC and just moving to building transformations. So I actually sit on the board of directors for Building Transformation. So it's like I said, a not-for-profit organization, recently rebranded about 3 years ago. It used to be the Canada BIM Council, but now with its international presence, rebranded to Building Transformations. Building Transformation drives the building and construction industry forward. It has many programs to serve members, including both in-person and online events, certification program for professionals, organizations, and educational institutions, think tanks for different segments of the construction and building industry, the annual awards program, and an annual innovation spotlight publication. The organization has grown to over 2,000 members. It's been around since 2007. Of that membership, there's about 40% represented from government and academic institutions, and then about 60% from the private sector. As you can see, the organization has grown quite a bit, has a pretty active YouTube channel, and a great LinkedIn following. So if you're looking to learn more about them, feel free to follow them or visit the website buildingtransformations.org to sign up for the newsletter. Just a little bit about some of the programs. So Building Transformations has membership options for organizations and individuals. Companies can join as an organization based on their size. One organization membership provides the whole team with an affiliate membership where employees can get access to member discounts to all BT events, access to join the think tanks, and to member-only content. The organization provides opportunities for startups all the way to large global enterprises. One of the things coming up shortly is the Innovation Spotlight Award. So Building Transformations has an annual award show, which is happening December 5th in Toronto. The nominees are going to be announced next week, and tickets are already on sale for the event. Following the award show, the organization does an annual Innovation Spotlight publication. So all past publications can be found online, and the 2025 publication will be launched in mid-March of 2025. Some events to look out for, which BT hosts in terms of in-person events, is the annual AGM happening January 21st. I believe we're actually going virtual for that one. Following the AGM, there's a Future Design and Construction event in Austin in early April. It's an engaging industry summit that will bring together leaders and decision makers from across North America. It includes 2 days of project tours, keynote speakers, technical sessions and case studies, a trade show with the latest software and technology. And then finally, Building Transformations hosts their annual flagship Future of Construction event in Toronto each August, followed by the annual awards program next December. Just wanted to thank their mission partners as well, listed here. And if you're interested again in learning more about that organization, visit their website. And finally, on behalf of the Research Center, we wanted to thank the Government of Canada, specifically ACOA, for making this webinar series possible, as well as our founding partner, OSCO Construction Group. And then thank our marketing partners who are all listed here and have helped us promote the series. Now, moving to the fun stuff, I'd like to welcome Jeff Van Deen, Michelle Hanna, and Lee Clary from Cast Consultancy to present on data-driven insights into offsite project performance from the UK. Jeff is a Director of Advisory Services, Michelle's Director of Project Management, and Lee, Associate Director with Commercial Advisory at Cast. Michelle, if you'd like to start sharing your screen, I will stop talking and look forward to the presentation.
Thank you, Brendan.
Yes, thank you, Brandon. Jeff Van Deen, Director of Advisory here at Cast, as it says on the screen. Thank you for having us on, to the team at University of New Brunswick and at Building Transformations. We would like to walk through with you some of our perspectives from the UK in terms of where the market's at, what the lessons might be at a high level in Canada, and so particularly some of our work in capturing data and using it to measure performance. Just a quick word on language. I know you guys use Offsite, we use Modern Methods Construction. We'll probably use them interchangeably as we go through. When we say MMC, we basically mean Offsite Construction. So I checked the presentation a second ago, lots of references to MMC, they all mean Offsite Construction. Anyway, Michelle, do you want to take us on?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Hi, everybody. So just before we get into the kind of exciting bit of the presentation, I'm just going to give you a brief overview into our business cast, just to set some context in terms of who we are and what we do and how we're involved in both offsite construction and other forms of on-site innovation through the different sectors we work in. So our business was set up in 2016. We have 5 founding owners who have worked in the residential and commercial sectors for a substantial number of years. Since we set up the business in 2016, where we've grown to just around 100 now we are in terms of team size, which, as you can see on the screen, is split evenly there between cost managers and project managers, with a growing team who are focused on strategy development. So that consultancy team does a lot of advisory work across a number of different sectors, including government. As a business, we are predominantly focused in the UK in terms of service delivery from a project or a development perspective, but we do actually work globally in terms of our strategic advisory team. Works with, as I said, governments, but also other governments from other countries, in which I'll come on to in a second. In terms of the markets we operate in, we obviously have cost management and project management. We do a lot of post-contract work with contractors, managing contract administration projects. And we also have a team that do technical due diligence and helping investors who are looking to either forward fund or acquire new land. In terms of the due diligence, it is to actually make that acquisition. A lot of our work is around modern methods of construction, which we're going to go into in terms of how the UK views that for the different categories that focuses in. And we also do a lot of work around master planning, which is working with some developers, both those based in the UK or those who have come from other countries to the UK, and looking to regenerate some of our major areas within the country. The sectors we work in outside of service delivery cross many forms and shapes of the residential market. Some of the language there is obviously not necessarily relevant to other countries, but in terms of the product that's offering, it is very relevant. So build to rent, similar to what multifamily housing is in America and Canada. And then we do traditional market for sale housing, as well as we've got a growing portfolio of work in the purpose-built student accommodation sector, as well as co-living. And we're starting to do a lot of work more around affordable housing with different types of clients, including institutional investors. Later living, for those not familiar, in the UK, it's more about retirement communities. So we work with developers who are looking to set up purpose-built retirement communities for people from 50, 60 plus population age. We do work in hotels. We class that as residential. Anywhere you can lay your head effectively is what we cover in our residential sector work. And as I said earlier, a lot of that is focused around master planning, which is predominantly around one of our core vision is around placemaking and creating those using residential and mixed use schemes. In terms of the clients we work with, you can see it's a wide range of clients from local authority clients or government body clients through to institutional investors, both UK domestic investors and international investors in the UK market, for the likes of Starlight Investments, who are a Canadian investor in the UK market, who we work with quite closely on a number of their developments. We do a lot of work with developers who are purpose institutional investors coming in to act as developer, who do long-term asset ownership. There's around 80% of the projects we work on, developers look to hold those in the long term. I'm just going to pass over to Jeff, who's just going to talk about how we look at modernising the market within our consultancy roles.
On Michelle's explanation of our business, we have a relatively unique perspective, we think, in terms of modern methods construction and offsite construction, because we effectively face both ways, which is what we're showing on screen here. So on the left-hand side, we have been influential in driving the industry in the UK and increasingly internationally towards enhanced adoption of offsite solutions. We authored the definition framework for what MMC or offsite is in the UK. I'll come on to that in a second. We've created measurement tools and shaped government policy and funding strategies on the one side, but on the other side, and this is what I think is pretty unique about the business, and Michelle set out our core focuses, we actually deliver projects. So showing on screen in the bottom right hand corner, Smith's Garden in Birmingham, Lee, who will talk to you in a second, is part of the team that's project and cost managing Europe's largest build to rent development to use volumetric modular offsite construction. So it gives us a really unique perspective on what's happening here in the UK and increasingly internationally. We recently finished a commission for the Offsite New Zealand and the government of New Zealand, which picked up the lessons from the UK, and we'll try and touch on some of those as we go through our presentation now, because hopefully some of those will help shape thinking in Canada and can give you information to be working with. A section briefly on the perspective from the UK in terms of what's shaping the agenda and what can you take from that in Canada. So we always start this presentation with the why, and we always talk about these 4 whys that are particularly relevant in the UK around skills and workforce. Here in the UK, we're short probably 250,000 workers in the next 2 to 3 years for the level of output that we're projecting right now. We have a new government that's ramping up expectations in terms of construction and house building. So we have a kind of gross shortage of construction workforce, and we also have key skills gaps in key specialist trades. So the start point is the workforce isn't there to deliver the kind of volume and quality of housing that we're going to need to do in the next few years. In terms of what we build, that's changing significantly. Government is pushing on rightly on enhanced environmental performance, what we call building homes, future home standard. We've had the experience of the Grenfell fire and building failures of various types in the UK, which is driving a building safety reform agenda. We're seeing with a new government coming in, likely increased push towards building better, effectively and rightly so. And better also includes measuring and reducing whole life carbon, embodied carbon. The UK is on a trajectory to net zero by 2050, and 40% of all of our emissions is from the built environment. So we are in a position where the built environment has to respond and decarbonise. And finally, and I'm sure this is the same in most parts of the world, the sector is not amazing at delivering what it sets out to do in the first place. So here our data shows that just under a third of projects in the UK run over budget and 40% run over programme. So the framing that we always use here is, given all of those ingredients, we need to be looking at ways of building more efficiently, getting more construction built for every pound that we spend in construction. And I know this is the same time around the world. We looked at this in New Zealand and came up with broadly the same 4 or 5 drivers for change there. They do vary slightly, but it does seem that construction globally struggles to innovate and change, and does suffer from some of these challenges wherever we look. We can maybe pick up in the questions the extent to which that's the case in Canada, but it's definitely the driver in the UK. Given that basis, there's been a lot of work here in the UK to try to drive industry to a different place. We show in 2016 the work that was done by Mark Farmer, our Chief Executive, working with the UK government, the Farmer Review of Construction and that labour model, which kicked off was part of kicking off a number of policy responses, which have created a huge range of intervention kind of reports and a number of interventions leading over the past 8 years or so. We now have a new government, and the new agenda for the new government is taking shape, so we expect to see further work of this type. I mean, we would kind of reflect that through everything that's been done in this space. There's been a number of investments, there's been a number of policy initiatives. At present, that sort of demand stimulus, the kind of corralling of effective demand to support change around new solutions hasn't yet materialised. It's not materialised anywhere, but ultimately that is the major driver of what's going to change industry, is a clarity and transparency of demand for a different product, and that's hopefully what we'll see coming forward from a new government. I think one of the key things that we would have to acknowledge from those first 8 years of our journey that we referenced before is that there have been failures in our industry, some of them reasonably high profile, of companies that have to various extents sought to evolve the business models, evolve the off-site construction methodologies being used in construction here in the UK. These companies have run into a series of different problems. I think it's absolutely the case that it'd be wrong to say this is a failure of off-site construction generally. Businesses have run into general business model challenges. They've run into a market that's been negative for a period of time here in the UK, and it's been difficult to sustain the manufacturing overhead. There've been quality and execution issues. We've had some challenges with venture capital and PE funding going into businesses and expecting businesses to change faster than they're realistically able to. But all of that said, there have been challenges here in the UK with businesses that have sought to respond to that agenda and have ultimately failed. At the moment, this is the list of companies that failed in the last couple of years in trying to innovate and drive change. But we are also seeing what we would see as a maturing market. So a lot of those models were highly disruptive, seeking to kind of maximise the extent of off-site construction in entirely new business models, entirely funding models, taking on developer, manufacturer, sometimes investor, all of that kind of vertically integrated risk. What we're seeing happening now is that that may not have worked, but we're not going back to the world that we were in 8 years ago. Instead, we're seeing an industry response, which is much more of a shift towards hybrid forms of construction. We're seeing established players in the market taking on board perhaps kind of lower extents of off-site manufacture, but shifting towards hybrid forms that combine off-site and on-site in more mature models. And that is definitely a direction of travel that we see being accelerated as the UK moves forward. In fact, I mean, we think it's really important at that point to just be really clear. Here we talk about MMC and you talk about off-site construction, but it's not a binary choice. It's not either using off-site construction or using traditional forms of construction. So we created a definition framework which is set out on the left-hand side and may well be something that would be appropriate for Canada to consider doing as well, to define all of the different types of construction that count as taking work away from the ultimate workplace, transferring processes and product production to more efficient measures, but focusing that on the parts of the building that make most sense for that to happen. So there's 7 types. I won't go through them now, but they run all the way from fully volumetric 3D boxes down to actually getting much smarter with how we're capturing data on site, how we're using workers on site, how we're augmenting worker processes using smarter forms of materials. That all counts, and it all takes labour away from the process, which ultimately is the aim. And the measure of that is what we call pre-manufactured value. Again, we won't dwell on it, but the ultimate point is a proxy measure for the extent of offsite construction on any project. It measures the material percentage relative to workforce, labour, prelims, and kind of logistics. And ultimately, the point being, we need to drive up the productivity of construction by getting more materials built for the same amount of labour. And that is where we'll pick up on the next slide, Michelle. The value that can bring. So in the UK, if you look at that overall sector, construction sector worth about £27 billion, and if we roughly try and break that down into what percentage of that £27 billion is actually turning out into materials, is about 40%, £11 billion, with the other 60% or £16 billion going into processes, labour, preliminaries, overhead, and profit and risk, and then all the other elements to go into building up the cost price of a construction project, which is driving waste, is increasing risk for all parties in the market. Everyone is exposed to wage inflation because of the size of that labour pool, and we are facing, as we picked up on before, serious quality challenges around quality and control. And our view is that dial needs to shift. It doesn't need to shift massively, but within that £27 billion, if we can go from 40% materials to 55% materials within the same amount of money, we're getting much more building for our money by driving out waste, driving down on cost, and the increased output for the same cost will be driving resilience into the supply chain, into our projects, and creating greater certainty and control. So that's our hypothesis about the value of offsite manufacture. And as we go through the rest of our presentation, we'll talk about how in real world situations we're capturing data that's starting to show that this is going to be the case, and there are data points that make this case and prove it. That being the case, we're not saying that every project needs to maximize the extent of offsite manufacture, and we're pushing straight towards the ultimate extent on every single job. Every job needs to be driven by the why, the how, and the what, and that needs to be driven by the client particularly. So the client developer will have a series of objectives that will shape the strategy for any particular job. The funder will have objectives. There will be site-specific constraints, and at any given time, the supply chain will be at different levels of maturity. So every single project needs to be assessed on its merits, and we are looking for an optimum level of PMV, and not a maximum level of PMV, but we are pushing towards the right forms of offsite construction for any given job. And then just a final perspective, if we kind of take that up to a more of a macro level from the UK, one of the things we reflected on as part of the work for Offsite New Zealand was, what have we learned about how suitable offsite construction is in different contexts, in different sectors, and we created this. I mean, it's very theoretical, but this is kind of for a university, so hopefully we can get away with putting a conceptual slide into the presentation. The left-hand side is intended to measure the extent to which projects are suited to offsite manufacture. So are they standardized? The extent to which there's a steady flow of work, and the sector itself will value the benefits that offsite construction brings. And the bottom axis is intended to measure the extent to which policy can drive flow, and there is control over the market. And when we populate that, what we found is that actually policy should be differentiated across market sectors. So there are market sectors that are very highly aligned to the benefits and requirements of offsite manufacture. So in areas like schools and defence accommodation, repeatable, standardised, driven by government procurement, there's a much greater kind of immediate alignment to higher PMV forms of offsite construction, and therefore potentially, and this is from the New Zealand context, but we share it with you because maybe it will spark some thoughts, a presumption perhaps in favour of offsite manufacturing in that context. In the top left-hand box, we're looking at parts of the market that are potentially highly aligned to offsite manufacturing, but actually the policy tools for driving them are lower. So in the commercial building market, for instance, there's much less control for government over volume and flow. And in the private housing sector, for institutionally backed construction, and Michelle talked earlier about build to rent, for instance, we see a huge amount of uptake of offsite construction in build to rent type projects where speed and certainty are valued by the investor. And therefore, then perhaps collaborating with that sector makes more sense. And then there are other parts of the market where it's much harder to make it work, particularly the private housing open market sale, where there's kind of low levels of repeatability, low levels of flow, and low influence for government. In that case, it's kind of leave the market to decide what the right answer is. Just thought we'd include that at the end to kind of summarise the UK perspective, that actually there isn't one market, there's several markets, and offsite applies differently in each of them. And at that point, I'll hand over to Lee to take you through what we're doing to measure and prove some of these theories.
I also, just coming back to an earlier slide that we touched on with what we do at Cast, we're in quite a privileged position in that we are outward looking to governments and other sort of industry leaders in the sort of influence sector, but the crux of our business is project management and quantity surveying. It is delivering projects, so we get to impact projects as well. And something that we're finding with that is that we have plenty of industry studies out there that are helping us on that influence side of why offsite manufacture or MMC delivers better projects. And that's what we're showing on the slide here, is that we've got lots of stuff out there that shows us that the speed increases, that it's less labour, that you can improve your embodied carbon, there's less disruption to sites, etc., etc. But what we're also finding is that when that comes to proper project delivery, it's not quite cutting it with our clients. It's not quite getting them to push the button to go with MMC as a route for delivery. What they're wanting to see is actual data on how projects have been delivered better. So what we've done is we've started working on studies that, again, at Cast, we've got a whole history of projects that we've delivered. We're starting to look at that data that has been delivered on those projects and trying to collect those into a sort of group of graphics that can actually prove how projects have performed throughout as an output. Michelle, we can move on. And something that we've done to try and quantify that is actually look at what clients are trying to achieve. So when we all used to go to university, particularly in the UK, we used to have the triangle of goals or project briefs that clients were trying to achieve. That used to be around time, cost, and quality. What we're finding now in the real world is that with all the regulations that are coming in and the safety, etc., that those are starting to evolve quite a bit. And that's become a much more difficult conversation to have. That time, cost is still there, quality is still there, but we're now looking at increased things like technology, like operational, like embodied carbon, sustainability, that also come up to the same level. So there's a whole raft of things that we're trying to help clients to achieve, and we see that offsite manufacture is something that can help them. So what we've done is come up with, at the bottom here, this standard set of measurements of how projects perform through their life cycle. One thing that we sort of have to call out here is that ultimately the time and the cost do always come to the forefront. If something doesn't work in terms of program, or if something doesn't work in terms of cost, then everything else is going to give, and we have to use those as our sort of benchmark to move a project along. But increasingly we're starting to see other things. So program and cost certainty is something else that we're seeing is coming in more and more, because you can go in with a cost and you can go in with time. That isn't typically what we see as the output. And as Jeff showed on his slide earlier, I think we're 32% of projects are over budget and almost half of our projects are over program. So whilst you can work up a scheme to that, it isn't quite what's delivered. So as I say, we've sort of highlighted about 60 projects within our company that we've delivered, that we're starting to pick up on all of these metrics and actually try to measure this data. It isn't data science. It isn't really detailed, in-depth data analysis that we're doing. This is very high-level stuff that actually on projects should be measured all the time, and probably are measured all the time, but they're not brought into a set of data. So this is something that we started working on. Michelle, we can move on. And just whilst we're doing that, we also need to sort of group projects together as to how they're being delivered. So we're using PMV as a guide to this at the moment. So as Jeff said, we're looking at projects where we're incrementally nudging the dial on PMV. This could mean that we go from traditional to traditional with bathroom pods to traditional with bathroom pods with utility cupboards, all the way up to fully volumetric projects, which we are delivering at Cast and we are measuring. The PMV will vary on projects. Even the very similar projects could vary between a bathroom pod having, a different value of tile, and that will swing the dial a little bit on PMV. So what we're doing is overlaying this with the categories of MMC that are also being used to start to see if we can find a trend of what type of PMV works best for which project, for which client, suiting their project brief, that we come back to that sort of diagram at the beginning. And we've got evidence of that already. So we've looked back at 8 of our projects in the office. Michelle, we can move on. we've looked back at a number of projects. I think it's 8 we've got on these graphs at the moment. We're starting to see a correlation between the PMV increasing and a trend line for how the improvement is being shown across these metrics. So the top left, we've got cost movement. We're finding as we're increasing the PMV, the cost movement goes down because we're getting manufacturers involved at an earlier stage, which means we get a little bit of fixity far earlier. Productivity is going up because we're having less people on site, less man hours on site, more in a factory. Program movement, again, we've got more certainty in program, and our speed's improving. We're starting to improve the how quickly projects are delivered as well. So when we add all of those in, I think people are generally accepting that that's good and that's what's going to come from this. What we do have to do is overlay this with the sort of cost side of it, and we're also starting to find that that has to be looked at on a project by project basis. There can't be a generalized assumption that using offsite manufacture or MMC is more expensive. It has to be looked at in the realms of the project and what's being achieved within that client brief.
So just coming on to a couple of case studies, I'm going to take you through some examples of projects that we're working on in the UK, both actually London-based projects that have adopted a form of MMC as part of their delivery. One of the projects is on site at the moment, and the other project is actually completed and handed over and in occupation. So the first project is Brent Cross Town. Brent Cross Town is part of this building, is one of the buildings as part of a wider master plan. So the master plan aims to create a new neighbourhood within a suburban area outside of central London. So it's probably around 15 minutes on a train journey into central London. It's not an area that is typically known as a flourishing area, so it's very much been identified over the last decade or so as an area in need of regeneration. The developer that is delivering that is called Related Argent. They are actually a partnership between Related, who are a US-based company who delivered Hudson Yards in New York, and Argent, who is a UK-based company who delivered King's Cross, which is, again, one of our major regenerations in London. So they have come together and they've partnered with the local council, which is Barnet Council, to deliver over 6,700 homes, about £8 billion worth of project value, which will include over 50 locations for retail, food and drink, and around 50 acres of green space across the area. So quite substantial and a long programme to be delivered. But this building is one of the first 5 buildings to come forward as part of that master plan development. It's actually the 5th out of the 5 buildings. The client was looking at the opportunity to deliver MMC throughout the process of procuring those 5 buildings, and ultimately ended on a solution for the 5th building, which it is delivering. The development was delivered by a shortlisted 2024 Sterling Prize architect, Alison Morrison. As I said, it's currently on site at the moment, being delivered by a contractor, Galliford Try, and they are using a precast facade and frame system, which is being managed by a company called PCE Systems, who are working with a manufacturer called Techrete to deliver that structural solution. So the panels are developed in Ireland, which come to the UK or to England fully fitted with their windows and balcony connections. And then they're fitted, craned in on the site, fitted, connected together, and then just final mastic finishing is done on site. This has meant that we've not had to use scaffolding, which in the UK is very negatively viewed in the UK in terms of health and safety risk. But also, this building has a sister building, which is located right next door to it, that is finishing earlier in this building. But this building will provide all of the amenity space for its sister building. Therefore, not having scaffolding means we've got something that may finish slightly later than its sister building next door because it's on a different program. But because it doesn't have scaffolding around it, it will look visually better in terms of the community growing and residents moving into that project. But if I just come on to the reason behind related arduous decision to deliver this building, which is aptly known as Plot 14, as a precast facade and frame. It was very much around, as I said, it was the 5th project in the first phase of the master plan for residential development. But it was a client that was very eager to innovate and challenge their norm. They were insistent they didn't want to build traditionally every building. They wanted to work out how they could build quicker and better and maintain high quality products. We tested a number of options in the market, and ultimately when it came to the 5th building, it needed to be completed within 6 months of its sister building next door, and the only way we were able to achieve that is through accelerating the program. Its sister building is actually an identical building in terms of size, and it's also a very, very similar product. They are both build-to-rent multifamily housing products, but because Plot 14 actually started later, it was, if it had been built traditionally, would not be ready in time for its sister building opening. So the client decided to look at a different procurement route and actually engaged with a manufacturer early on in the design process to develop the designs with the architects, with the engineers, to allow it to be procured with a offsite manufacturing process in mind. We then engaged with a main contractor once we had the manufacturer on board, and managed to forge a relationship between these two, where the main contractor then took the subcontractor on board and is delivering the project on site at the moment. And we're going to just show you some of the stats in terms of where we are in terms of that journey and where it is comparing with its sister building. But ultimately, this is going to give the client the opportunity to test the case for the next building, the next. And with having 6,700 homes to deliver, there's a huge opportunity to gain some real program certainty here.
I think something that's just quite important to note there is that this is a real unique opportunity for us to capture data on 2 projects being built by the same contractor off of the same podium at the same time to almost identical size and number of units and specification, but in 2 very different methods, one being built quite traditionally, one being built with sort of offsite manufactured frames and facades. What we've done here, so our measurement data at the moment is only up to month 8. One of the first projects that went is a little bit ahead of it because it went first, but we're trying to do just a comparative month by month here to see if the data matches through the stages where we're not using the offsite manufacturer, and then how far it actually goes away from each other when that offsite manufacturer is on site. But on the left-hand side, we've got some sort of key stats as to getting into contracts. So comparing like for like on the frame for facade, even though Plot 14's bigger, there's a 22-week benefit that we've found, that we're doing it 22 weeks quicker on Plot 14 on the frame and facade delivery. Obviously, the critical path then swings into fit out, so that gets negated slightly. It comes down to an overall program benefit of 14 weeks, but we're delivering a larger building and a denser building, so slightly more complicated, in 3 months, or just over 3 months quicker. We have found, coming back to cost, that there is a slight premium when we're comparing the 2 components together. However, that doesn't account for things like preliminary benefits or program benefits, and it also doesn't account for things like your increased return on investment that you would get from being able to let the units earlier. And the bottom one's quite telling, actually, because, as Michelle said, we got this manufacturer on board earlier through the process. The design was fixed earlier in the process, and that means that our cost movement has been significantly less on Plot 14 than it has on Plot 13. So Plot 13, from stage 3 cost plan through to where we are at the moment, there's about an 11-12% movement in cost, whereas on Plot 14 we're only seeing about 3% on that, and that was because that fixity was achieved earlier. On the right then, we're just looking slightly at how we're performing to date. As I say, we're sort of up to month 8 on this, so through the substructure, and this was where the manufacturer had just got onto site. I think there was 2 or 3 months in and we're delivering, but we're already starting to see a major difference in some of the key metrics that we're measuring. So there's a 16% reduction in waste We've actually seen up to 75% reduction in vehicle movements. We need to dig into that a little bit more because it's only been 3 months on site, so to find out why that is. But that is something we're seeing, and 0 reportable incidents in terms of health and safety. So we're starting to see some real sort of tangible data coming out of that to show how it's performing, as well as that early stage sort of contract differential as well.
So the next case study is Portland's Place, which is in Stratford in London. Again, a more of an industrial area, really. It's actually the home of what was the Athletes Village for the 2012 Olympics and Paralympics held in the summer in London. And the intention was to take that development as the Athletes Village and repurpose it for homes for rent. And Delancey and Qatari DR were successful in their bid to redevelop the area. This is one of their buildings that completed actually on the 10th anniversary of the Olympics ending, so in 2022, and it was delivering 520 homes for build to rent. And the contractor who delivered this building was Mace Tech, which is part of Mace Construction. And the model they used was a high-rise solution model. So they had developed a concept where the precast and all the slabs in the frame and the walls were all precast off-site. So they had a construction zone off-site where they formed slab modules. So they had a number of modules of varying sizes that effectively were used to form all of the slabs. And the frame, the facade of the frame was actually manufactured also off-site, and it was connected to the slab off-site. So I think there was an image earlier actually which showed the facade coming to site on a section of the slab. It was craned in, and then all the slab was connected together. In addition, actually, on the offsite part of the slab development, the actual bathroom pods that were going to be craned in, the recesses in the slab were actually created for those offsite. So there was very little work in terms of concrete that was used as part of the on-site delivery for the project. When all of the modules arrived on site, it took about 20 minutes to put them in place. And there was, because they actually did the slabs and the facade off-site connected and brought that site together, there's actually a substantially less number of deliveries on site. I think Lee would just take you through some of the metrics from this project.
So again, we're sort of showing that level here of the PMV of how much was done off-site compared to on-site. This is talking through the sort of, as a comparison on the left, on those floors that were the high PMV, when we got to the certain stages, comparatively where they were on the right-hand side. So structure completed at the same time, but you can see on the left-hand side, they were only up to level 1 on the facade and not even started the service distribution, whereas on the left-hand side on that tower, they'd already completed it, and that was using less than half of the operatives. So it's gone up a lot quicker on that side, using a lot less labour on site. Again, just going back to some of our statistics that we found on this. So it's been an 18-week program benefit, and 30% faster to start the fit out. There's been a lot more productivity, so less sort of more sort of cost per man hour that you're getting out of it due to the less operatives being on site. And on the right-hand side, again, we found a major reduction in waste that's coming off the site and in the vehicle movements that are going to it because of that component sort of deliveries. And there was a 15% reduction on the embodied carbon as well. So again, showing some sort of tangible data benefits of delivering using that higher PMV.
That's all from us.
Great. Thank you very much, Michelle, Jeff, Lee. So we have about 12 minutes left. So there's some questions from the audience. I have quite a few that could take up another hour as well, but let's get to the audience questions and then we'll go from there. The first question that came in says, in the UK, it appears more government projects use MMC than private developers, especially in the residential subsector. I'd say that's similar across like internationally as well. And the question is, what do you think is responsible for that? The public sector owners leveraging MMC more than private?
I'll take that one. So I think it's also a question of what forms of MMC we're talking about. So I think it does vary, and there are large parts of the private market that are increasingly using forms of offsite construction. I'll come back to that in a second. But generally, we find that the public sectors we work with, the housing associations, local authorities, are much more heavily incentivized themselves to look for a higher quality product. They're quite keen to be at the forefront of driving into particularly more sustainable forms of development, and that drives them to think about how they build and the sorts of solutions they might be able to bring in. In the private market, interestingly, there's been a kind of quite a significant recent shift, like our house builder market here, the volume house builders that we have that build most of the homes in the UK, is now almost kind of received wisdom that they'll all use a form of timber frame, maybe open timber framing, but that's becoming pretty much the main way that the private market builds. And then in the more complex buildings, we've shown a couple of examples there, but where we have investor developers that are incentivized to develop quickly, to reinvest their funding into new developments, and who value that speed and particularly the certainty that they get from using different forms of construction, that is driving uptake of all sorts of forms of offsite construction. I think the major barrier to uptake generally has been particularly in the volumetric sector. There's a nascent part of the market. There's quite new companies that are in there. There's not a huge amount of track record. So what we're finding is pretty much everything outside of that, categories 2 to 7 in our list, is increasingly being uptaken all across the market in hybrid forms of construction.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Anything to add to that, Jeff or Lee? Or sorry, Michelle or Lee?
I would just add to that. We traditionally in the UK, we're very much an industry that focused on the for sale housing. So most of us, it's very much a supply and demand model, but there is never an incentive to accelerate the builds to have too many. So there wasn't that incentive in terms of the program benefits you get out of going down a modern methods construction route. But as our industry has grown and we see a lot more buildings coming forward that are for rent, a lot of institutional investors and private developers getting more comfortable with the manufacturing sector and the process and what that looks like in terms of the quality of the product, are starting to look at MMC as a solution because it gives them program certainty, it gives them cost certainty. Whilst the cost may in some instances be a little bit more expensive than building traditionally, they feel that the program outweighs the benefit. So we are seeing a step change in that because we have different sectors that people are looking to deliver housing in rather than just being the for sale sector.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Going to the next question. So this is tying to some of the failures from the organizations that you showed. Says, could you share some of the key reasons behind the failure of those? They list software companies. I think they were mostly manufacturers that you showed. Was there some software as well? Yeah.
So one of them was Modulus, which was a really interesting company trying to create a software platform for a kit of parts forms of offsite construction, which then they had quite a complex model to bring to market with it, and actually a lot of this comes into the complexity. They were quite a good example around just the kind of basic complexities of getting accreditations and warranties for complex new forms of componentized build. I think the other key reason, ultimately it comes down to, I said, demand, and lots of those we showed on screen had reasonably high fixed overhead models, which mostly construction doesn't have. So they were running high overhead models in a market that in the UK is definitely cyclical anyway. All residential development is pretty cyclical. So running high overheads in a cyclical market is difficult. Running it in a market that's going down is even more difficult. And then what we saw, a lot of the organisations took on more risk, so it became developers to give guaranteed pipeline through the factory, which solves one problem but brings in additional risks. So that was another key feature of what we saw. And ultimately, the market conditions were a major part of what we saw, the reasons for failure there. It comes down to demand, stability of demand, and being able to match that against the overhead that you've got in the factory settings, which is why we think more hybrid models are more likely to be the next move. They're lower overhead, more flexible, and probably the next the next step forward. There'll always be a need for volumetric modular, but in certain circumstances, the bigger part of the market will be everything else, really.
Yeah. Now, I don't want to take up too. We're getting a lot of questions coming, so I want to go pretty fast. But I will say, in what we've seen in North America, and I think we talked about this, Jeff, is a lot of ones that have a lot of investment money, and the targets of the objectives of the investors don't align with what the market is ready for, the construction market's ready for. So that alignment, and then you're kind of trying to take on too much and trying to be everything. Katera was one of those examples in the US. Moving to the next question, for the and this person actually did some research at Cambridge University, so she's familiar with the PMV and some of the different KPIs and things. So question is, for the quantification of the KPIs, how can we ensure that the data collected and used are consistent, as we have to collect multi-source data from schedules, as-built drawings, camera images, contract docs, sensors, etc., and triangulate them? It could be time-consuming to clean the data before putting them to measurement models. Missing data is also a headache. So yeah, how are you quantifying these KPIs and pulling it all together, all the different sources of data?
So I completely agree. Missing data is a headache, and trying to track these month by month rather than just the start and end points. It is a challenge, but I think the sort of answer there is that at the moment, the projects that we're tracking and retrospectively looking at are our internal projects that we're working with developers. So being the project managers primarily on these projects, we're actually in the weeds with them anyway on the delivery. So we're assessing those as part of our monthly jobs as we go along. What we are also starting to do is start to look to work with manufacturers and developers in the UK as to how we can help them capture the data on their projects that we're maybe not working on. So they start to do that systematically. And I think that's something that we're going to have to work through as we go forwards. Like I say, it's something new that we're working on here because we've seen that it needs to be done, and it's something that's going to help us drive forwards. And it's something that we are working through and developing it as we go along. So we've set those metrics. A lot of what is there as a metric, we actually have to capture as part of the sort of regulations in the UK anyway. So it's helping us in that sense. But to actually clean that data, like I say, we're going to have to work our way forward. How we do that on projects we're not so intimately familiar with, because that will be time consuming to clean it, as the question asked.
Yeah. No, for sure. Thank you for that, Lee. I might do one more. I'm just monitoring time and don't want to. I know it's later in the day for the folks in the UK, so don't want to take up too much time. But just one more question here. Colleague Craig, and he and I have talked about this, and others. Actually, we've talked about it with Cass as well. So there's difficulty with taxonomy definitions, offsite definitions, etc. in Canada, and I'd say around the world. In our opinion, UK, as an outsider looking in, has adopted the MMC framework, and that's been a top-down approach, and those categories are well defined now. What was the process for gaining acceptance of those definitions in the industry, and where would you recommend, let's say, Canada start in terms of getting the government to adopt something like that? And don't say that because Mark Farmer yells loud, because I know
He does.
yeah, I know that. But let's say we don't have a Mark Farmer sitting in Ottawa, for example.
Yeah, to be fair, it did start. It started with Mark's report. I mean, that was the catalyst in terms of one of the recommendations was around, there was a bit of a setting up a working group, and actually government being actively involved in actually helping industry shape and make sense of what MMC was. We've been talking about MMC for a very long time, before the farm review, and referring to it as MMC, but no one ever quite understood what it meant. And I think the starting point when Mark's paper landed and another paper followed that, it was a bit of, right, we've got to take a moment here and work out what do we actually mean when we say MMC. And so a working group was formed by government. So it's a task force that was formed, and that task force first action was to work out what MMC meant. So we had government support. And I think that was the fact that the government came out with the farming review and actually sponsored that being done was what we did. So we did a lot of lobbying government to get them to be actively involved. We also had a lot of really senior people within the industry lobby government for them to get involved, and I think that was it. It was kind of like a collective hearts and minds, but we are not there yet. We have a definition framework. It is widely used within our industry, but it's not fully used. It's still not adopted to its entirety. So we're still on that journey of actually people really understanding what all of the categories mean. There's been a very much high focus for us on category 1, on volumetric, and we as a business purposely talk about MMC in the 7 categories to try and promote that. So you just need promoters within it, or people who are out there actually showcasing there's more to it than 1 or 2 or 3.
Yeah. Well, not like Offsite Construction, we are titled as a research center. People do still associate that with volumetric modular, and then associate that with single family residential building. So you said MMC in that category. Yeah. So I'm just like, we're at time now. So I do have like a couple wrap up slides. There's a couple questions we didn't get to, Curtis and Ashwini. I'll ask Jeff, Lee, and Michelle if they could maybe respond to those questions via email, and we can send those answers out to everyone who registered. Just quickly, I wanted to thank Lee, Jeff, and Michelle for their time today. As mentioned, this is the first webinar of 8 that we're hosting monthly. It's the 3rd Thursday of each month. Our next one is with Gillian O'Boyle from the UK as well. She's a partner at EY, and she's done some work with some of the Canadian folks local to Nova Scotia or Atlantic Canada. And they recently released a report titled Unlocking Value Through AI in Infrastructure. So what the future could look like with AI in the infrastructure space. And so that's our next webinar. We have another one in mid-December with DPR Construction. They are one of the largest general contractors in the US who have, created 3 companies, subsidiary companies under them, looking at, different categories within MMC. So pods, panelized structural systems, utility pods, etc. So we'll have a presentation from them on their journey into offsite construction. Again, I just want to thank our sponsors, ACOA and OSCO Construction Group, and thank Jeff, Lee, and Michelle again. Like we said, this is recorded, so we'll be sharing this publicly, as well as the slides with all registrants and all attendees. Thanks again for coming, and talk to you soon.
Thank you.